Hi, and welcome to week 2 of Research and Information Skills. This week we're going to be examining the question, where can I find information? A question that's important to all students who begin a pathway into education, particularly at university. However, before doing that, I'd like to talk a little bit about these recordings. For the most part, they follow certainly elements of the PowerPoints, and they're based on the PowerPoints. The reason I don't do PowerPoints with voiceovers because I don't feel I'd like to be bound to necessarily the pattern of the slides, only because I guess I'm bound or chained to that particular sequence. What I do when I lecture in a classroom is often go out on many tangents and many asides. Sometimes they are incredibly relevant to the material, sometimes not, but I find being restricted to just a set pattern, a set course of information, personally I find that a little bit awkward, in the sense that I'm almost running through a rehearsal, which I don't like to do. What I should say also is that these recordings are going to be a lot shorter than the lectures that I do on campus, and that's not because necessarily that I'm going to cut any of the content out. It's because I like to cut right to the chase, cut to the important aspects or important points that I feel have to be fleshed out. These are the ones that I like to emphasise. A lot of the examples and other things that I'll include in these recordings highlight those, so you won't be necessarily getting a slide-by-slide recording. That being the case, as I said, I'll still be covering what I consider to be the important points. Beyond the fairly truncated form in which this recording occurs, there'll be specific instructions at the end of each lecture that's directed towards distant students. Obviously, attending students get access to these materials via Milo as well, but I guess there's some recommendations that I would make, particularly for distant students, and I'll be doing that at the end of lectures. And also I'd like to also try and include distant students in the tutorials, which is fairly difficult because most tutorials are about discussing ideas and so on, but I guess there's certain points I'd like to raise and maybe attempt to be more inclusive. In the past I've not necessarily avoided this, but thought that it was possibly too difficult to always include distant students, but would still like to make some sort of attempt if that's possible. Moving to today's work, in the last lecture, via the introduction, I discussed the fact that there's information everywhere, and that information is the basis and the main source of not only our knowledge but also the decisions we make. This week what I want to look at is how our knowledge and the information, our sources of information, are fairly limited if you kind of examine even your own sources of particularly news and information. And though the two central sources for a lot of people, the internet via Google, and I would also argue Wikipedia, and that I guess I could put that in brackets after Google, and also things like TV. But what I want to concentrate is particularly Google and Wikipedia, and then I want to move to what will become a mantra in this unit, the UTAS library website, and how we begin to do searching and scoping using facilities through the UTAS library system. And what I should say now, and I'll say it probably several times through this semester, is that the UTAS library has the biggest range of sources that you will need for your studies, and that being the case, essentially that becomes the main portal for you to get sources of information and resources to use in different assessments. Anyway, let's get on to the main part of today's lecture. So if we are looking for information, what's the problem with just Googling it? In that case also, what's the problem with using the Wikipedia site, which generally is generated as the first search result that comes up when you're looking through a page of search results? There's a lot of just those two questions within themselves are kind of interesting, because a lot of people don't look beyond it. In my experience, certainly in secondary school, is that these two particular mechanisms, one that went searching for the information, the one that delivered it, i.e. Google through to Wikipedia, became literally something that people did by rote. There was never any questioning. and I should say right from the start, that never reference Wikipedia. The reason Wikipedia shouldn't be referenced, I'll talk about a bit later on, but essentially, as a starting point, do not reference Wikipedia. Anyway, moving into the actual mechanisms of these two particular arms of information retrieval and information results. Have a look on slide 4, and there's a link there that I've put to how Google works. This is a very benign approach to Google, and obviously because it's produced by Google, it's very, very favourable, and it gives Google, and I guess it's all of its mechanisms, a very benign view. However, there are plenty of issues with Google, one of which, when you search for something on Google, the return results generally governed by popularity. So in other words, if a site is deemed to be popular, it will appear very early on in your search results. So literally the number of hits that website has had over a period of time, there's an algorithm within Google that can measure those particular things against others, and then that then produces your search results in extraordinary quick time. Sadly, what comes with that is often targeted adverts, so in other words, if you go searching for a particular item or a particular bit of information, for instance, you'll find, as I found in England, and just to give you a brief example, and one of my many asides, I deliberately and consciously went looking for 3 things that I would never be purchasing. I think from memory I looked at something like lipstick, a bra, and something else. I can't quite remember what, but 3 items that there was in no way that I would want to purchase for myself, perhaps for my wife, but anyway, the point was I went looking for these items, and within 2 days a whole range of adverts and emails started appearing in my Hotmail account and also in my Google searches of these particular items I looked within 24 hours. So in other words, I was tracked and then targeted with adverts that they assumed that I would want, and I found it was somewhat disturbing that even 2 to 3 years later I still have adverts appearing via my spam mail in Hotmail that still relate to these products that, like I said, I had no interest in buying, would never buy for myself. I guess the key message is, and I highlight this in slide 5, is that because it's a popularity contest, it doesn't necessarily mean that the particular results that you get are the ones you want or the ones that you can use, particularly with academic work. And what you'll find is that often the least popular works are the ones that are used by academics, and this is because they're often fairly dense in the sense that they cover a lot of ground and they've got a lot of information, and there's some difficulty in understanding that information, and you have to work your way through it, which is a poor way of, I guess, defining the word dense in that sense. But anyway, other criticisms of Google, and I've highlighted this on slide 6, is that it collects data on individual users, and even worse than that, certainly from my perspective, because I abhor or loathe advertising, it's a platform for advertisers. So, as I say, through popularity, people advertise on the most popular websites. That generates more traffic to that particular site. So Google's picking out those sites that are the most popular. They become more popular, they advertise more, and so you have this ever-increasing circle of popularity. The more worrying aspect is that there's a single hub, so Google becomes the central place where people go searching for information. Because it's a fairly controlled or engineered search result based on popularity, the types of information you get, and I think we've probably all experienced this, that come down to a search result are often a long way away from where we need to be, particularly, and this is evident in academic work, a long way from what we should be using or like to be using, and just because, like I said, it's popular doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. Now, regarding Wikipedia, in principle I think it's an extremely good idea. You have a global community who can contribute to an online encyclopedia. In principle, it's an excellent idea, and there are millions of people who have contributed. Some of the issues, however, relate to the fact that that the information, because it comes from so many different sources, is not necessarily credible or reliable. In that sense, Wikipedia is kind of hamstrung by its contributors, and unless articles are obviously vigorously reviewed and referenced and seen to be so, those works you can't reference in academic work. However, what I would say about Wikipedia is that it's actually a good starting point. It's a platform, it's a jump-off point to actually a much bigger exploration of a particular subject or topic. But that is all it is. Ultimately, it's probably a source for different references if the article is referenced. I have to admit, at times I've kind of certainly gone through Wikipedia articles just to get a feel for a particular subject. What you look for is common names in an area, in a theme. So if you have several authors, for instance, who appear regularly in articles, those ones are worth tracking down, trying to get full articles for, you can then use in your work, so particularly in assessments, etc. Some of the big criticisms of Wikipedia, and there are, and I think they're valid, that Wikipedia, the articles contain incorrect, misleading and biased information. It violates copyrights, which apparently the staff at Wikipedia are working on, or at least their volunteers. That it often has limited or incorrect references. The fact that it is prominent in the search results, say for Google, doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily the right way to get information. Just because I said it keeps appearing doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. Rather interesting too, the Wikipedia's culture of anonymous editing, administration results in a lack of responsible authorship. Now, the last one was highlighted to me when I was in England. I was teaching a group of students, one of whom was, I would, to be generous, was a little bit naughty, a bit mischievous. He decided to actually create a website, or I should say an article, in Wikipedia on the particular college that I was working in. He put himself as principal of that college, and then changed all the details about the number of students, etc. Now, in principle, it was very funny, but rather disturbingly, the article was still up many months later, with completely contradictory and a mischievous message about the particular college. And because no one had accessed that particular site from the college, it was never changed. And if this was done in, I guess, one account, then why couldn't it be done for a lot of different things that are done in Wikipedia? So from that point on, I've been fairly cautious about what I read on Wikipedia, and I'd recommend the same to you too. Moving to the UTAS library, if you have a look on slide 11, I simply highlight the fact that library resources go through a review process, not a popularity contest. By a review process, I mean that there's essentially, I could put in a request for a book. It has to go through a review committee who deem it to be of academic merit, academic worth, and then it would be purchased and put on the shelves in a particular library. This goes for all purchases throughout the library. In this case, librarians almost have to justify their selection of books and magazines, etc. And the selection process is fairly rigorous because obviously there's a budget to consider, and only so many books of so many types can be bought, etc. And that goes for subscriptions, etc. So you won't find a subscription to Hello magazine. However, you will find a subscription to a medical journal, for instance, and that's because to medical students that would matter. Hello magazine might be of use to perhaps sociologists, but only a limited extent. Perhaps the biggest resource, and the one that I'd highlight here, and I've said this in slide 12, or on slide 12 I should say, that the library subscribes to academic journals. Those subscriptions, and there's many hundreds of them, are invaluable to getting up-to-date information about a particular area. For me, this is critical. If you want to know what's going on in a particular topic area, a particular subject, then you can literally search down for free, which is the real bonus, for free, and get all the current research that's being done. So all the contemporary ideas and theories and actual, like I said, results of different research that's been done in a particular area. This is invaluable to your work. Now I have to say that the library is available or I should say access to the library is available anywhere, so you can access it at home, and I can't see why you wouldn't use it. In fact, to me, it's the main portal that you should be using to get all of your information. I mean, I would also promote the local library, although their catalogue is slightly more limited and it's much more popularist. That's because they're trying to obviously suit a whole range of tastes, and whereas at university library it's simply for students and obviously for lecturers for background information on either assessments or on lectures. Anyway, the one thing I would mention, if you're having difficulties perhaps accessing the UTAS library, which I dare say you won't, but if you did, another option on Google is Google Scholar. This is worth considering because it's far more suited to finding academic articles for a particular issue. So on page 15, I've given you literally a screenshot of what Google Scholar looks like, and all it is literally has the word Scholar underneath the word Google, and then when you literally have options down below which talks about articles, which is generally the one that I go for. Click for search, and then on page 16 I've given you an example of the results that you might get back and the format that they'll come back in. Now, what I should say about Google Scholar is that they don't always have full articles, which can be fairly limiting. However, you can literally apply certain parameters on how it's searched. So you've got an advanced Scholar search where you can actually ask for solely full articles. And the reason you don't get full articles is because these articles generally, certainly newer ones, have to be paid for. You have to subscribe to a journal to get access to them, and this is often very expensive. And publishers of the articles won't simply be able to make as much money from them because they're older. People are more interested in contemporary research, so that you can actually get access to free articles. Be a little bit circumspect in how you use these, or circumscribed in this case, because given that it might still be a good bit of background, it may not reflect current thought or current data on a particular issue. Now, if you're attending, we would have a discussion about some of these aspects. In fact, what I often like to do, particularly with the Wikipedia bit, is have the group actually construct an article in Wikipedia. So what they end up doing is I choose a topic, say something like fish, and we look at what are some of the core ideas that we'd have to have in there. What are perhaps some humorous things? What are the more practical aspects of a particular subject? So I get the students to work in groups, and then we come up with each group. That is, we come up with a page. So what we would include, and rather intriguingly, when we examine the different groups, the results of the different groups, what we find is that often there is a lot of information that's left out. Some people are very precise, some aren't, and if that was the only information you had available about that particular topic, you'd be somewhat hamstrung in your understanding of that particular subject. The second thing that we would have been doing, and I hope all of you in distant student land get a chance to do this, is to actually going on a library tour. I get my students to come in and then spend a good half an hour to an hour with our librarian, who shows not only the physical resources but also the electronic, and it's the latter which becomes far more important. We have a fairly small library here, and rather symbolically the books have been pushed into a corner, and I think over time will erode because things will be digitised, so we won't necessarily need them. I personally like hard copy. It's only because that's what I more or less grew up with, and certainly through my academic training I spent a lot of time in books in the bowels of a library, and enjoy that as a process. It's very tactile, and I guess reminiscent of my earlier education. Anyway, coming in to have a look around the library and have a look at the library systems is well worthwhile, and I guess what I'm saying to you now, if you can't come in, start having a look simply at the online catalogue. So if you have a look at Summon, put in any topic and just start to explore, start to navigate, start to find information. Even if you don't read any of it, just have a look at the search results, see what comes back. To me, this is worthwhile time this week, because you're going to be using that particular portal, so the library portal, a lot. The task that I was set, certainly the final task, if there was time, is on the final slide, so slide 20. I was trying to get the students to look at, and I will be this time, get the students to look at several areas, and I've just put a range of subject areas up there: psychology, geography, sociology, etc., and get people to go and search out some information about that particular one. So I've said 5 key facts about the topic, and they have to start to record some of the information. And it's in the most limited way, so we're not launching straight into referencing, but it's actually just simply taking a note of the author and the title and the year of publication and starting to habituate that particular process. So when you look for material, you acknowledge and record the author, etc. This is good practice, but also it's a courtesy to the author. Plus, of course, helps to stop you plagiarising. Anyway, now moving to the tutorials this week, and my attempts to include distance students, because I want to embrace all the students who attempt this unit. I've put in 2 alternatives. I put one, which is simply, if you'll open the PowerPoint, simply is a thylacine spotted in a suburb of Hobart. And the point of this particular tutorial is to get students discussing where we get our information from and what sort of information do we get back from it. If you have a look in the notes underneath the slide, even though they're for teaching staff, it's more or less the directions for you, and you can attempt this at home. So you'd have to consider a range of sources of information in relation to the headline, discuss what types of information is likely to come from each source, and then using the table, begin to examine the disadvantages and advantages of each source. And each is limited in their own ways. There's always pros and cons for most things. The alternative tutorial I've titled Verifying the Truth, and I guess it's examining more or less the same issues, but from a far more personal account. I have to say this is, I guess, slightly personal in the sense that during my honours thesis in my first degree, I looked at religious experience and how we can verify that. So how do we verify if someone is telling us the truth about, say for instance, someone suddenly announces that they've had a chat with God, or they've had this experience of God? How do we verify that account? And of course in studies of mysticism and studies of religious experience, there are measures, I guess, that try and quantify that. Not very successfully, I might add, but that was difficult within itself. I spent the best part of 2 or 3 months of my honours research trying to actually work out how those verifications are achieved, and came to a very, I guess, I wasn't necessarily disheartened, but I realised it's a very complex issue. Anyway, I guess I've drawn from my experience of that and given the example here that if we were to try and verify if someone was telling us a particular bit of information, where would we go? Now on the slide, what I've put is a bunch of possible sources of information. So if as the case as be, we've heard and we want to go and talk about, I want to find out if a cashier has indeed had a conversation with God in the canned foods aisle, whether books or journals could tell us anything about religious experience in those particular settings or contexts, whether we could find information straight off the internet, which I imagine there's incredible amounts of information. Try and obviously enlist experts to give us an insight. We might even consider going to a local library, and obviously I think over time we'd have to talk to family and friends and even the employees of that particular person to actually see if there's any consistency. And what we've had often in our discussions in the class is that a lot of people seem to think, well, no matter who said anything like this, that they've got to be crazy, and other people are kind of far less quick to kind of judge. If you kind of have the situation where, and this is the example I use in the classroom, that if someone who you particularly trusted, say a family member, maybe a friend, someone who didn't have any reasons to lie about an experience, who suddenly made a claim like this one, without exaggeration, without necessarily attempting to get any sort of or achieve anything by it, whether it's prestige or whether it's status or whether it's infamy, notoriety. If they're not trying to achieve anything, what would you do in terms of believing it or not? And for me, I've found enough evidence of people's experiences that it was very difficult to discount these types of experience outright. At least, if nothing else, the people who have these experiences believe that, and I guess I believe they believe they've had the experience. But there were enough instances where it certainly created uncertainty in my mind, and certainly a level of reservation about making quick judgments, because I certainly had to trawl through all those different sources to try and find answers, and a lot of the time unsuccessfully. I've put a list underneath there, certainly in the notes section, that is aspects of things that you have to consider in terms of the sources, and I've put 6 of them there, and I think all of these things, I guess, throw some light onto the situation, but not all. I mean, some of these things may indicate, maybe instability in a particular person, or a propensity to have these experiences, or maybe a history of them. But also, particularly if they've come out of nowhere, and I guess I have to bring in a family example in here, that my grandmother, who was a very old, stoic Victorian woman, said that while sitting to watch TV, and she lived next to us, she was probably in her mid-70s at the time, who had no belief in God or any sort of afterlife or ghosts or anything like that. She was utterly kind of stoic and very hard in her convictions, said that while sitting there watching telly, or just about to watch telly, almost like an apparition of her brother's face came from the corner of the room and came down to her. And she said immediately she knew that he'd died. And I found this an incredible kind of claim and an extraordinary sort of experience for her, in the sense, the way she described it. She was very matter of fact, but she said that that she was utterly convinced that he died at that point. And that within itself is kind of an intriguing thing, because my grandmother gained nothing by it. In fact, if anything, it contradicted her previous position totally, and she couldn't explain it, neither can I. But it was a fairly interesting sort of juxtaposition to her general sort of positioning on life. Now, obviously, I don't want to get too esoteric here, because that's not the point. The point is just where we find information. How do we come to an answer about something? We have to obviously go and investigate. And when we investigate, we go and hopefully check through a whole lot of different sources, get armed. I'd like to think that the word armed is quite good in this process. Armed with knowledge, and then we can come to a better perspective about a particular thing. From my own study over many years, I've realised that it's very difficult now for me to just literally fall on one side of an argument. In fact, probably one of the better aspects of study for me has been the fact that I can now, without necessarily serious conviction, juggle a whole lot of right answers in inverted commas or parentheses, and then be happy juggling. I don't need to actually have a particular right answer. And of course, some people would argue, commit yourself to a particular position, but I find it very difficult, because you begin through academic training and through your analysis of different sources to open up the vistas of your opinion. And so for me personally, I use less emphatic language, am less sure about things, have less convictions, and in a sense I'm very postmodern, whatever that means. I mean, it sounds kind of cliched and absurd, but I guess by that I mean that there appears to be very few universals that follow through, that don't have contradictions. There's none that I can see in life, and I think really going with the postmodernist idea of satirising most things, I think we have to have play, that's another word that postmodernists use, play with some of the information, the ideas that we have, and the concepts of ourselves almost. There's a frivolity there. I mean, obviously there are serious things in life, and we have to actually act on that basis. But equally, I think there has to be a point where the absurdity of life and the contradictions and the paradoxes in life become almost overwhelming once you start to examine them. Anyway, I digress as always. Coming to the distance study guide, there's several small exercises that I think are worth doing. If you have the time, just simply check through, even if you just literally go through them as a process, not too worried about the results. I think that will be profitable in that sense. The other thing worth considering is the article Getting Past Google, and it's just general advice. even if you don't necessarily apply it. I think it's worth considering. Okay, that's plenty to get on with this week. Hope you have a good week, and yeah, good luck with everything. Bye for now.